Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive into some really fascinating Buddhist thought. We're going to be exploring, what do we call this one? Empty and Annihilated. It's a really thought-provoking title, I think, right?
Yeah, it really is. When you first sent over the source material, I have to admit I was a bit taken aback.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear your take on it because, I mean, this idea of being empty and annihilated, what could that even possibly mean?
Well, I think it's helpful to remember that the texts we're looking at, they're all grappling with this concept of sunyata, which is often translated as emptiness.
Oh, yeah, right. Emptiness.
Yeah.
It's a big one. And I think that's where the annihilated part really got me thinking.
But that's interesting. What was it about that word that jumped out at you?
I think it was just the intensity of it, you know? Annihilated, it sounds kind of scary, almost violent in a way.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think it's important to remember that we're not talking about annihilation in a literal sense, like a physical destruction.
Okay, so it's more of a metaphorical annihilation.
Exactly. It's about the dismantling of our illusions.
Ooh, I like that. Dismantling our illusions.
You know those things we cling to about ourselves and the world that ultimately cause us suffering.
So is it more about annihilating our misconceptions than ourselves?
Exactly. Think of it like this. We tend to cling to this idea of a solid, unchanging me.
Right, like a fixed self.
Yeah. But what if that me is more like a wave in the ocean? Constantly changing, arising and dissolving, ultimately inseparable from the water itself.
Wow, that's such a beautiful analogy.
And it really gets at the heart of emptiness.
So emptiness in Buddhism, it's not about things not existing. It's more about this idea of lack of inherent existence.
Precisely. Things exist, but they don't have this independent, solid, unchanging essence.
It's all about interdependence then.
Exactly.
Things exist in relation to everything else.
And in a constant state of change.
It makes me think about some of the stuff I've been reading about quantum physics.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, this idea that even at the subatomic level,
Yeah.
everything is in flux.
An interconnect. That's a fascinating connection. I love how these ancient Buddhist ideas can still speak to us in such profound ways, even within a modern scientific context.
It really is remarkable. And, you know, it brings us back to this idea of annihilation.
Right. How so?
Well, if we're clinging to this false sense of solidity, of permanence, we're bound to suffer.
Because that solidity is an illusion.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to build our houses on sand.
Exactly. And the texts we're looking at, they offer a path to something more stable, more lasting, through recognizing this emptiness.
And there was this one passage from the Lingyan Sutra that really caught my eye.
Which one was that?
The one about the path to nirvana through, what was it? The exhaustion of hearing.
Oh, yes. That's a powerful one.
It is. But I have to admit, exhaustion of hearing sounds pretty intense.
I know, right? It definitely grabs your attention.
So what does it actually mean?
Well, it's not about literally losing your hearing.
Okay, good, because that would make this deep dive a little difficult.
Haha. Right. It's pointing to a deep meditative practice where we become so attuned to the nature of sound itself.
So, like, really paying attention to sound.
Yes, to the arising and passing away of every single sound.
Okay.
To the point where we transcend the content of what we're hearing.
So it's not about what we're hearing.
It's about the experience of hearing itself.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And in that process, the sense of a separate self who is doing the hearing starts to dissolve.
So we start to see that even our perception is empty of inherent existence?
Exactly, just like everything else.
Okay, so if we can free ourselves from this tyranny of our senses, from the constant stream of thoughts and judgments, maybe we can find a deeper kind of peace.
That's the heart of it, but it's not about becoming emotionless or indifferent.
Right, it's not about checking out a life.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a different way of relating to our experiences.
A way of being that's rooted in wisdom and compassion. And, you know, speaking of wisdom and compassion, these texts offer some really specific practices for cultivating those qualities.
Absolutely, like the section on the 108 sins.
Oh, yeah. That was a doozy. When I first saw that title, I was like, whoa, this is getting serious.
I can imagine.
But then as I read further, I realized it wasn't about conventional morality.
Right, it's not about being a good person or a bad person.
It's more about the ways we create suffering for ourselves.
Exactly, by clinging to things that are ultimately impermanent.
So maybe a better translation would be 108 ways we cause ourselves unnecessary suffering.
I like that. It really captures the spirit of these teachings.
Because it's not about punishment or guilt. It's about offering a path to liberation.
to freedom from the suffering we create for ourselves.
And it's interesting because a lot of these sins are tied to our sensory experiences.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
We often think of our senses as the gateways to pleasure and enjoyment.
Right, like a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal.
Exactly. But the texts are pointing out that even those seemingly positive experiences are ultimately fleeting.
Right, they arise and pass away.
Just like everything else.
So even if something feels good,
if we cling to it, if we demand that it lasts forever,
we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the pleasant experiences either.
Right.
Even the unpleasant ones, like pain or unpleasant smells.
They're also impermanent.
They arise and pass away, just like everything else.
It's like the whole world is a constant dance of arising and dissolving.
Yeah, of coming into being and fading away.
And we're a part of that dance, whether we realize it or not.
And you know what's really trippy? Is that even our thoughts are subject to this constant flow of impermanence.
Yes. You highlighted a passage that mentions how even the arising and disappearing of our thoughts can be considered a sin if we don't understand their emptiness.
Yeah, that one really blew my mind. Because we tend to think of our thoughts as so central to who we are.
Right, like they're solid, unchanging realities.
But they're not. They're just mental events.
Exactly.
Arising and passing away, just like everything else.
And yet we get so caught up in them, so identified with them, that we forget their true nature.
It's like we're mistaking the map for the territory.
That's a great analogy.
We get so fixated on the mental representations of reality that we lose touch with the actual lived experience.
And that's where the suffering comes in.
Right.
When we cling to those thoughts, when we believe them to be true and permanent.
Yeah, we create all this unnecessary stress and anxiety for ourselves.
Exactly.
But the good news is, these texts offer a way out of that trap.
And that's where mindfulness comes in.
So mindfulness is about waking up to the impermanent nature of our thoughts.
Yes.
About seeing them for what they are, just passing mental events, not the dictators of our reality.
You're getting it. It's about cultivating a different kind of relationship with our thoughts, a relationship based on observation, rather than identification.
So by recognizing the emptiness of everything, including our thoughts and sense experiences, we can potentially free ourselves from the suffering. That comes from clinging to them.
That's the heart of it. It's a profound and paradoxical teaching.
It is.
By letting go of our grasping, by embracing the impermanence of all things,
we open ourselves up to a deeper kind of freedom and peace.
Exactly.
This is already so insightful, and we've only just scratched the surface. I can't wait to continue exploring this in part 2 of our deep dive.
Me neither. I'm looking forward to it.
It's really interesting to me how these Buddhist texts, they don't shy away from the tough stuff like suffering and loss and disappointment, you know, those really difficult experiences that are just a part of life.
It's true. These are all part of the human experience. And the beauty of these teachings is that they don't offer some kind of magical bypass around these challenges.
Right. It's not about pretending that everything's always going to be okay.
Exactly. Instead, they offer a way to relate to them differently.
And I think that's what's so compelling about these teachings for me. It's not about denying the reality of suffering, but about finding a way to work with it so it doesn't completely overwhelm us.
Oh.
You highlighted a section that compares this to being caught in a rip current.
Yes, that's such a powerful analogy.
I think it is. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So when you're caught in a rip current, your instinct is to fight against it, to swim directly back to shore.
Right, which makes sense.
You would think so, but actually, that often just leads to exhaustion and panic.
Oh, wow. So it's actually counterproductive.
Exactly. The skillful approach is to actually relax,
Reload.
to allow the current to carry you for a bit.
Wow.
And to trust that eventually it will spit you out into calmer waters.
That's amazing. So relating this back to the Buddhist teachings, are we saying that? Sometimes the wisest course of action is to actually surrender to the difficult experience.
Yes, to allow ourselves to feel it fully without resistance.
That's so counterintuitive.
It is, but it's about a wise and compassionate awareness of what is, without getting hooked by our habitual reactions.
And that's where mindfulness comes in, right?
Exactly.
It's about being present with our experience, even when it's painful.
Yes, and recognizing that even the pain is impermanent.
It will eventually pass.
Yeah, exactly.
So how does this idea of surrendering to the flow of experience, how does that relate to the concept of the 108 sins?
Well, I think the key is understanding. that even these sins, these patterns of clinging and aversion that create suffering, they're themselves impermanent.
So they arise.
They have their moment on the stage, and then they fade away.
Just like everything else.
Precisely.
But we have to see them to believe it, right? It's not enough to just have an intellectual understanding of impermanence.
You're absolutely right. There's a passage in the Mahavapulya Mahasangika Sutra that addresses this directly.
Oh, really? Which one?
It says, if you do not see sins arising in the void, nor do you see sins extinguished in the void, then you bodhisattvas have not yet understood.
Okay, I have to admit, I need a little help with that one. First of all, who or what is a bodhisattva?
So a bodhisattva, in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, is someone who is dedicated to achieving enlightenment for the benefit of all beings.
Wow, so it's like a really advanced practitioner?
Yes, you could say that. They embody this profound compassion and wisdom.
Okay, so this passage is addressed to bodhisattvas.
Yes. And I think it's urging them to move beyond intellectual understanding and into direct experience.
So how do we do that? How do we actually see these sins arising and being extinguished in the void?
That's where mindfulness and meditation come in.
Oh, okay.
These practices help us to develop a kind of inner radar that allows us to observe the movements of our minds with greater clarity and precision.
So it's like we're becoming archaeologists of our own minds.
I love that image.
Carefully excavating the layers of conditioning and habitual patterns that create so much suffering.
Yes, and as we observe these patterns with mindfulness and compassion, we start to see that we're not our thoughts.
We're not our feelings.
We're not even the sum total of our experiences.
There's a sense of spaciousness that opens up.
Exactly.
A recognition that we're something more than the constant chatter of our minds.
And that spaciousness, that awareness that's not bound by any particular thought or feeling, that's the taste of freedom, the taste of liberation.
You know, in my notes, I wrote down this question. If there is no self, who is it that's liberated?
That's a brilliant question. It really gets to the heart of things.
Because it seems paradoxical, right? If there's no self, then who or what is experiencing this freedom?
It is a profound paradox. And I think it points to the limits of our conceptual thinking. The idea of a self is ultimately a construct.
A story we tell ourselves.
Exactly, to make sense of our experience.
But that story isn't the whole truth.
Right, there's something deeper, something more fundamental that's beyond our grasp.
So maybe it's not about some separate self that's liberated, but rather about the liberation of experience itself.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Recognizing that all experiences, whether pleasant or unpleasant, are ultimately empty of inherent existence.
Exactly, and that has profound implications for how we live our lives.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, if we can truly grasp the emptiness of self, the emptiness of all phenomena, it doesn't lead to nihilism or apathy.
It's a common misconception, I think.
It is, but it actually opens up a whole new way of being in the world.
Okay, so what does this new way of being look like in practice? How does it affect our actions, our relationships, our sense of purpose in the world?
That's where the rubber meets the road, and it's something we can explore further in the final part of our deep dive.
We've been talking about some pretty heady stuff. Emptiness, impermanence, even this idea of annihilating the self. I imagine some of our listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed.
It's understandable. These aren't exactly everyday topics.
Right. So I think what a lot of people are wondering is, how do we actually live this? How do we take these ancient Buddhist teachings and apply them to our modern, messy lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And I don't think there's a simple one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
But I do believe these teachings offer some incredibly practical tools for navigating the complexities of human experience.
So let's talk about that. How can understanding emptiness actually lead to a more meaningful and fulfilling life?
Well, one key aspect is this idea of letting go.
Letting go. That's a big one.
It is. We've talked about how clinging...
The things that are impermanent is a recipe for suffering.
Exactly.
But letting go can be so hard.
It can, but it's not about suppressing our emotions or pretending we don't care.
Right.
It's about cultivating a different kind of relationship with our experiences.
How do we do that?
Well, remember that analogy we talked about earlier about holding a bird in your hand?
Oh, yeah. If you clench your fist too tightly, you crush the bird.
Right. But if you hold it gently, with an open hand,
it's free to stay or fly away.
Exactly.
So it's about finding that balance between engaging with the world and recognizing that we can't control everything. And you know, there's a passage in the Mahavapulya Mahasangika Sutra that talks about this.
Oh, which one?
The one about how even pleasant experiences
Yeah.
can become a source of suffering if we cling to them too tightly.
Oh, yes. It uses the example of pleasant sounds heard by the ear.
Right, like listening to beautiful music.
Or
Or the sound of a loved one's voice.
exactly. Those things can bring us joy.
They do.
But if we become attached to them, if we demand that they last forever,
We're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
because they will inevitably fade away.
It's like we're trying to build a house on a foundation that's constantly shifting and changing.
Exactly.
That's bound to collapse eventually.
And so this brings us to another important point, the cultivation of gratitude.
Oh, yes. Gratitude.
When we truly grasp that everything is impermanent, that this very moment is fleeting and precious.
It takes on a whole new level of significance.
Exactly.
I know, I often find myself caught up in thoughts about the past or worries about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I miss out on the beauty of what's happening right now.
It's so easy to get caught up in those mental time travels.
It is.
But these teachings offer a way to ground ourselves in the present moment
To really savor the richness of experience.
without clinging to it or pushing it away.
And that brings us to another important question. How can understanding emptiness help us navigate those really difficult times in life?
The times when we're experiencing loss or disappointment or pain.
Exactly. Because when you're in the midst of suffering, it can feel like it's never going to end.
It can. And that's where understanding impermanence can offer a profound sense of hope. Because when we truly grasp that everything is in flux, that even the most intense suffering is impermanent.
It opens up a space for possibility.
Yes, for healing, for transformation.
It's like remembering that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn.
Exactly.
So it's not about denying the pain or pretending it doesn't exist.
Right.
It's about recognizing that it's not the whole story.
There's a larger context, a wider perspective.
That allows us to hold the suffering with more compassion and resilience.
Beautifully said.
But this brings up another question for me. How do we reconcile this understanding of emptiness, of non-attachment, with our responsibility to act in the world,
That's a great question.
to care for ourselves and others?
It is. And it's something a lot of people struggle with.
Because if everything is impermanent, if our actions are like ripples in a pond that eventually fade away, then why bother doing anything at all?
Right.
Does it even matter?
I think that gets to the heart of what it means to live a skillful and compassionate life.
Okay.
Understanding emptiness doesn't negate our responsibility to act. Vibrate, it enhances it.
How so?
Because when we recognize the interconnectedness of all things, when we see that our actions, however small,
Have consequences that ripple outward.
yes,
It inspires us to act with more awareness.
more intention, more compassion.
So it's not about nihilism or indifference. It's about realizing that our actions matter, precisely because they're impermanent. Each moment is an opportunity to create something beautiful, to make a positive impact on the world, even if that impact is ultimately fleeting.
And I think this understanding has profound implications for our relationships as well.
How so?
When we see the emptiness of self, we also start to see the emptiness of the boundaries we create between ourselves and others.
So it breaks down that sense of separation, of me versus them,
Exactly.
and allows us to connect with others on a deeper, more compassionate level.
That's the beauty of it.
It's amazing how these teachings can be both so profound and so practical.
They really can.
They offer us a way to understand the world and our place in it in a way that is both liberating and empowering.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
I'm sure our listeners will be pondering these ideas for a long time to come.
I hope so.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the heart of Buddhist thought. Until next time, may you all find peace and freedom and joy.